Three of the most common words used by Trump, his administration, and Republicans in Congress are waste, fraud, and abuse. Tackling these issues was one of Trump's core messages during the presidential campaign. But when it comes to waste, fraud, and abuse, too often the call is coming from inside the White House. Trump, the president who decries diversity, equity, and inclusion and calls for hiring people on their merits, picked the richest man on the planet Earth to rein in federal spending, which Elon Musk and his Doge team totally failed to do. Meanwhile, Republicans in Congress are working to pass Trump's big, beautiful bill, which Democrats are warning could lead to drastic cuts to Social Security and Medicaid. Trump is also pushing for his party to pass $5 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in tax cuts, which would add an estimated $5.7 trillion to the national debt. The playbook for cutting government spending and passing tax cuts is nothing new for Republicans, but a new podcast from The Lever is unpacking how the anti-tax movement grew in the 1960s from a radical political movement to a leading pillar of the current president's presidency. The four-part miniseries is called Tax Revolt, and it's available on major podcast platforms. Joining me now to break down the series is executive producer David Sirota, who was once a speechwriter and senior advisor to Bernie Sanders and is now the founder and editor-in-chief of The Lever. David, thanks for coming back on Mehdi Unfiltered.
Thanks for having me.
So for those who haven't had a chance to listen to the podcast yet, give us a brief rundown of what it's about. What do we learn that's new from this podcast?
So one thing that's important to remember in our economic discussion is that we used to have an economy that had similar, or certainly after the last quarter, better levels of growth when we had higher marginal tax rates. And those higher marginal tax rates existed in the middle of the 20th century amid the largest expansion of the middle class in our country's history. And there was a handful of folks who didn't like that in the 60s into the early 70s. And they created really a movement to focus intently on cutting taxes. And they had a revelation, I think, in this time about the idea that the Republicans could try to compete with Democrats who were winning on promising New Deal style programs, that the Republicans could compete by being what they called the Santa Claus of their own, that they could be the Santa Claus of tax cuts. Whereas the Democrats were the Santa Claus of spending programs, the Republicans could be the Santa Claus of tax cuts. And this became, they found their Santa Claus in Ronald Reagan, who through two successive tax bills cut the highest marginal tax rates down to roughly where they are right now. At the same time, using the reduced government revenues as a way to argue for cutting major spending programs that support the working and middle class of this country. All of this set the stage for Trump's tax cuts. I think the revelation here, though, or at least one of them in our series, is that you now have a situation where, according to new polls, 70% of Republican voters want higher taxes on the wealthy. And what you see in polls is that Donald Trump's tax proposal for a new president, or at least coming into the first 100 days, is at the lowest approval rating of any previous Republicans' initial tax proposals when they came into office. Reagan's first tax cut's popular. His second tax cuts in his second term, not as popular. George Bush's first tax cuts, George W. Bush, his first tax cuts, not as popular as Reagan's. So the question then becomes, well, why has the Republican Party, why have voters soured on tax cuts? And I think the answer is because over many decades, people have come to learn that while the Santa Claus of tax cuts is providing gifts to the very richest, that those benefits are not trickling down. And so when people hear tax cuts now, they don't necessarily assume that's going to benefit them.
So one of the really interesting things that we learned from your series is that the anti-tax revolt on the right took off not in Alabama or Mississippi or Texas, but in California. Talk to us about California and this man, Howard Jarvis, who I'd never heard of. Liking this video? Then don't just watch. Hit like, share, and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to Zateo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism.
Yeah, so California was the hotbed of the anti-tax movement in the 1970s, and actually beginning in the 1960s. Howard Jarvis was a small business guy who organized through the ballot measure process. And there's ballot measures especially in Western states, easier access to get ballot measures on the ballot. He ran a series of ballot measures in California that became championed by then Governor Ronald Reagan and ultimately passed into law in California, Proposition 13, which was limited property taxes and the like. They then saw ballot measures in states like Massachusetts. These things proliferated into really an anti-tax revolt. And again, it came out of California. People forget that California, as now considered a blue state, was really a hotbed of this right-wing republicanism. And remember, the Republican Party wasn't always the party of the anti-tax movement. That's another thing that I think will kind of blow people's mind, right? Ronald Reagan ran in a Republican primary in 1976 against Gerald Ford after Gerald Ford had tried to raise taxes. And the anti-tax movement at the time really ended up through that primary and then into the 1980 election, taking over the Republican Party.
Yes. I mean, marginal tax rates under Eisenhower was super high. He was a very famous Republican president. It's interesting that Jarvis pushes these ballot measures through that not only cut taxes, but it makes it significantly harder for politicians to come along later and undo those tax cuts, to raise taxes. He requires a 2/3 supermajority to pass any new laws that would raise taxes in California. What has the impact of that been like on states like California?
Well, it's been huge. And I'm talking to you from another kind of state that did that. I'm coming to you from Colorado, which the anti-tax movement in the early 90s passed the so-called Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It makes it very difficult to raise revenue for the basic infrastructure spending, social safety net spending that are necessary when the population grows. So you look at a place like Colorado, you look at a place like California, where the infrastructure hasn't been updated in a lot of ways in many decades. A part of that has to do with the fact that it's more and more difficult to actually raise public revenue. Even if you want to, by the way, pass tax cuts that make the tax system more progressive, right? I mean, California has one of the highest percentages of the wealthiest people in the country as a percentage of its population. It is very, very difficult to raise taxes in California because of the process obstacles put into place, as you mentioned, higher vote thresholds in the legislature and the like.
It's interesting, when Jarvis was campaigning for Prop 13, which you mentioned, he faced quite a few opponents, including from big business and the media. And after publishing editorials opposing the ballot measure, the LA Times published editorials opposing it, Jarvis called the Los Angeles Times the enemy of the people, which is a reminder that the Donald Trump playbook isn't that original. I'm just wondering what other parts of the Trump playbook, the modern GOP playbook, trace back to the early days of the tax revolt.
Well, I would first go back to the idea that tax cuts, the insinuation that tax cuts will benefit everybody, right? Donald Trump talks about a big, beautiful tax bill. The details of who is actually going to benefit the Republicans and Trump now assume that no one's going to really focus on those details. Portraying all tax revenue as wasteful government spending to increase the size of the so-called bureaucracy. Again, that you've heard a lot of that of late with Elon Musk, the Doge, Donald Trump. That comes straight out of the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, when you read some of Ronald Reagan's speeches about the problem is the government, right? The government's not the solution. Government is the problem.
Yeah.
Reagan obsessively talking about the size of the government. That is what Donald Trump is effectively mimicking and parroting right now. And we're living through a time where you can see every day the actual real world effects of prioritizing tax cuts over a government that can accomplish the most basic necessities that we need it to accomplish.
One of the other similarities between Reagan and Trump is they build this image of pretending to care about debt and balanced budget, and yet they add more to the debt than other presidents. The second episode of the podcast focuses on Reaganomics, points out that during his presidency, Reagan accumulated more federal debt than the entire history of the United States, nearly tripling it to $2.7 trillion. I was doing a debate recently on BBC Two's Newsnight show with Trump's former ambassador to Denmark, and she started harping on about the debt. And I said, your boss in his first term added more to the debt than Obama, than Biden, than Clinton. And she said, oh, that was because of COVID, which is not true, actually. He raised the debt through his tax cuts well before COVID hit the United States. How is it that Republicans have been able to build, David, you've been fighting against the right for a long time. It must frustrate you as much as it frustrates me that they have managed to acquire and maintain this image as the party of fiscal discipline, fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, the party that cares about debt, all the while being the presidents, Reagan, Bush, Trump, who add more to the debt than anyone else.
It's so frustrating. Look, I think the Republicans realized in the Bush administration, there was a quote that floated around: "Deficits don't matter."
Yeah.
Right. And let's make that precise. What they're really saying is, when Republicans are presidents,
yes,
deficits don't
and when
matter.
the deficits are caused by tax cuts, not spending bills, they don't matter.
Exactly. Now let's ask, how did those two things come to coexist in our politics? Tax cuts, but you can portray yourself as a fiscal hawk. Well, there was a theory by the economist Arthur Laffer that came out of the 1970s, famous meeting between Laffer, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld during the Gerald Ford tax debate, in which Laffer drew a curve on a napkin at a restaurant. And the argument was basically, the more you cut taxes, the more you will stimulate economic growth, the more tax revenue through that growth will be generated, and therefore tax cuts are allegedly deficit and debt neutral. Now, we've lived through 40 plus years of seeing that not be the case. And you have to ask the question, well, why is that not the case? And I think part of the answer is, if you cut taxes for the super wealthy who have a disproportionate share of the wealth, they are less likely to quickly spend it to stimulate the economy than if you provide tax relief or other benefits to people who desperately need the money to survive, who are going to spend it immediately. So one reason the Laffer curve doesn't work is because of the way the tax cuts are structured. Going back to that idea, a Santa Claus for billionaires and the wealthy, not much for the rest of us.
Yeah, I've interviewed Art Laffer a couple of times, and he still stands by that ridiculous curve, even though it's been demonstrably proven to not work, including in Kansas, where he was put in charge of tax cuts, and Republicans in the state legislature had to undo his tax cuts. One of the people interviewed for this podcast is retired law professor Michael Gratz, who started his career in Nixon's Treasury Department and has since written several books on taxation. He said one thing that struck me as quite pressing. He says stories trump data, and the opponents of tax increases have been much more effective in marshalling stories. And I wrote a book about persuasion and debate, in which the second chapter is all about the importance of storytelling. When do Democrats get their act together on storytelling? You've been a speechwriter to Bernie Sanders. You look at Donald Trump, who's all story, right? There's no facts there. His entire persona was made up by NBC and The Apprentice. He wasn't a successful businessman. That wasn't even his office. It was a set. Like, the guy's been a master of creating stories and telling stories. Meanwhile, Democrats are busy, producing very well-researched 22-page policy documents.
Yeah, look, I mean, the problem is that the Republicans have figured out a way to have policy reinforce their story. Let's use what's gone on with Doge, Elon Musk, and Donald Trump. Yeah. They gut the government. They make the government unable to do the basic things we need the government to do. And then they cite the failure of the government, the subsequent failure of the government to do what it needs to do, as proof that the government needs to be further cut more, and that the best policy is to simply give as much money as possible to the wealthy through tax cuts. It is a compelling, if completely dishonest and ridiculous story, but it is a story. And Ronald Reagan was the master of telling those kinds of stories. I mean, the story of the so-called welfare queen and the like. I mean, they have mastered this. And I think the problem is that the Democrats have spent 30 plus years trying to negotiate with Republican stories about government. I mean, it was Bill Clinton who said after the Reagan era, the era of big government is over. He didn't say, we shouldn't have gotten rid of or cut to the bone the government policies that we did during the Reagan year. He essentially appropriated the stories of the Republicans. I would say that what the Democrats, one thing they need to be able to do is tell a story of what government resources can and have done to make people's lives better. The Biden administration actually had a story to tell on this when it came to enforcement of labor laws, antitrust laws, going after corporate abusers, corporate wrongdoers.
Big Pharma.
But Big Pharma, it didn't really tell those stories.
Well,
right? The story was barely told.
Well, we're now told that when Kamala Harris wanted to tell some of those stories back in August of 2024, her brother-in-law from Uber apparently, reportedly discouraged her from doing so. We all saw how that worked out. Trump and the Republicans are masters at creating villains and pointing at villains. And the way you look at right-wing social media right now, USAID is like a Bond villain right now. They think USAID was the worst thing that ever happened. It was a criminal end. Like, they've done that in a matter of weeks. They created this enemy, this foreign aid department that was kind of random enemy, but they did it. And Democrats haven't been able to do that.
Now ask yourself this question. Why do the Democrats so often seem to avoid calling out enemies?
Exactly.
I mean, you saw Senator Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan talk about how we supposedly shouldn't use the word oligarchs.
Yeah.
And
so
what underscores that? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm glad you raised that, because in response to that, Bernie Sanders, your former boss, was very curt in pointing out to her that Americans are not stupid. They're turning up to his rallies. They understand what oligarchy is. By the way, she uses the phrase oligarchs when she's talking about Russia. I should point that out. As someone who once worked for Bernie Sanders, what do you make of the rallies he's been doing with AOC that have really galvanized a lot of Democrats, not just progressives, people across the party have been inspired by Bernie and AOC. What do you make of the rallies? Were you surprised that the turnouts are even higher than when you were on his campaign? When he was running for president, he didn't get as big crowds as he's getting now. And also, kind of the rider to that question, is AOC his heir?
I'm not surprised by it. I think that people are turning out, whether they supported Bernie Sanders or not. A lot of these interviews with people saying, I wasn't necessarily a supporter of his in the presidential campaigns. I think people are coming out to hear at least a few people, a few political leaders, be willing to name the villains, to be willing to name the problem. That there is such a lack of that in Democratic politics, that the Republicans have dominated that part of the discourse. And the reason there's been a lack of that is because the Democratic Party remains trapped between its donor class, that its leaders don't want to offend and alienate, and its voters who want a party that is a real opposition party, an opposition party not just to Trump, but to what Trump represents. So I think the crowds are a recognition that, hey, at least someone's out there naming the villains. And I think AOC being part of that is she the heir? I don't know if you call it that. I would say sort of one of the people who has been inspired by and who is participating in the Bernie movement. I would say this. I don't think it's a good thing for us to view movements as sort of individual focused, single politician focused. I mean, you need leaders, but what I see here is the potential for a whole new avenue in the Democratic Party. And look, the establishment of the Democratic Party clearly doesn't like it. I mean, Alyssa Slotkin is sort of from the establishment wing of the party. You got James Carville out on television screaming at David Hogg, the DNC official who is saying we need a new generation of leadership. This is a fight inside the party. And I should say, it's not a new fight. I mean, this fight has been going on for a long time. And I would say this, if the Democratic Party cannot see that it needs to have a more populist, anti-oligarch approach at this point, then the question becomes, will it ever see that? I mean, I think there's a real opening to change this party, but if the establishment can still suppress that populist foment in the party, it really speaks not well of where the party's going to be.
David Sirota, we'll have to leave it there. Tax Revolt is available on wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.